So the final thing is domesticity. A true woman was devoted to the home. The domestic life was a true woman's calling. She must raise the children. She must maintain a comfortable home, and which was both tidy and sanitary, and that's very important, sanitary. And it was her responsibility for the health of the household. And this is really important. So anytime a big disease or something went through a house, it was blamed on often the wife for not having a sanitary house or not. And when you're reading Bold Spirit, you need to kind of think about this debate, like about what Helga has to deal with the fact of that when her children get different diseases, whether she's there or not, that it is her fault. And this is a reason it was maintained that women had to keep not only a tranquil home, but a sanitary home. And not only a physical sanitary home, but a spiritually sanitary home. That she must provide at all cost a sanctuary of her husband. Because for the first time, a lot of men were not only leaving the home, but they were working in offices if you were in the middle or higher crust. So they would work in offices and they weren't expected to do anything. It was ridiculous to ask for equality, and even women who worked in factories were responsible for keeping home a tidy, sanitary house. It was expected of them. So working in a factory for 12 to 16 hours, days, they would have to come home and do all the domestic spheres. This was not expected of husbands. It was not an equal opportunity, and we have a tendency to overlook this for our what we are dealing with our society versus in the past. And this was an idea that perpetuates from not only this period, it goes prior to this period, and then it continues, like I said, so much so that submissiveness was considered that women had to submit all the way up until 1993 and could not claim marital rape. On top of this, a woman that was against this ideal of true womanhood was considered a threat to society, a threat to America. Women who failed at any one of these spheres were unfeminine, fallen angels of society. They were associated with being sometimes the Antichrist. Women who divorced were considered social outcasts. They, no matter what the circumstances, it did not matter if your husband beat you. It did not matter if he was a drunkard. If you divorced, you were the social outcast. So much so in any from the upper class to the lower class, you could not get a divorce. If you did, your children were often taken away from you. And so women stayed in really abhorrent situations in which they were beaten or sexually, emotionally, physically abused multiple times, that or even were on the deathbed in many cases from having too many children. They could not leave that household because their children were taken away from them. They would have no financial security, and they were outcasts of society. It was believed that young girls could be ruined by books at this time, and education and free thoughts were the downfall of the true woman. This is seen quite often, even though education in women during this period does rise to about 22%, 25%. It was still seen that if you gave women too scandalous a book, they would be corrupted. They would, if by learning to think and have these ideals of individualism, and to go against the fate of submission and stuff, it was seen as kind of as they were corruptible. Women were seen as easily corruptible, and this goes back to original sin, where Eve was corrupted in the Garden of Eden, and this is brought up a lot. And women were constantly forced to know this because they had to be the pious ones. They taught their children at a young age, and their daughters at a young age, that you are part of the sin. And it was considered, even, for example, in the medical field, that often women weren't given chloroform or even any kind of um, anesthetics, because they were going to be corrupted by original sin. In fact, childbirth, up until Queen Victoria started giving birth, it was not fashionable that women could have any kind of pain reducers, because it was their sin that they had to bear. And childbirth is supposed to be painful according to, because they according to original sin. It's a very interesting and crude way of thinking, but this was a lot of the thoughts at this time. And Queen Victoria did kind of bring some of the stigmatism away from that when she had chloroform when she was giving birth, but even then, for the majority of women, it was seen that you were supposed to have that pain. Just to understand also the kind of, again, with medicine, is that women were seen, many women who had stress and anxiety and anger or restlessness or any kind of sexual appetites or excessive chattiness, a lot of this was viewed under hysteria. And so this was a medical term at the time, or melancholia. And so they were placed in often sanitariums and into asylums without their consent. In fact, women could be put into asylum by their husband, and they could never leave. In often cases, they were considered. They could be considered insane if they wanted a divorce. They could be put in a sanitarium for that. There was moral insanity. And hysteria comes from the Latin for hysteria, or hysteric, which is from the Latin for womb. And so it was seen that a lot of women were crazy because of their female anatomy. Just to understand how extreme some of these sanitariums and asylums are, often women went under electric shock, waterboarding, beatings, isolation, neurological treatments, including lobotomies for some of these problems, and medications that often made things worse. Women were also injected with mercury if for extreme hysterias, as well as cancer. If you had ovarian cancer, up until I think 1900, you were often injected with mercury into the ovaries. Also, women were going through menopause would also have leeches placed on their genitals. There was a lot of crazy medical things that are associated at this time. And the sanitariums and also the asylums at this time had very little governance by the AMA, the American Medical Association. And these conditions were pretty horrifying up until at least the 20s. There's a lot of reforms with sanitariums in the 20s and then in the 30s, as well as in the 50s. And then, but some of these reforms don't go quite as far as they need to. And often with women, it's overlooked, or people of color. Erotomania, also known as hypersexuality, at this time was considered extremely dangerous for female patients and would lead to extreme bouts of hysteria. And so women were also prescribed for cold showers, cold compresses, anything that would get them to calm down. And one of the things that ended up happening is doctors would administer vibrators for physical stimulation to women. And so they would go into the doctors. There's with electricity, with the development of electricity, you get vibrators is one of the first things that happened. And this was seen as a prescription to defeat the over-anxious woman, or the woman who suffers from erotomania. And so they go to a doctor and either be physically stimulated by the doctor, but also by vibrators. And also often their husbands would and parents would often notice how relaxed and calm women were after these sessions. And this was a common treatment for hysteria. Many doctors, including in the new field of psychology is a new field at this time, limited women to their biology. Sigmund Freud famously wrote that women were called the dark continent. and pretty much not a lot was known about this. In his lecture on femininity in 1933, for instance, he discusses that that the riddle of femininity, or of the sexual differentization. Freud rhetoric impeaches that women are the causes of all. There's a reason that Freud likens a lot of problems back to the mother. And so Freud also viewed women as being um, uh, as being uh, mutilated men, and so because they were mutilated, they were inferior, and this was common practice in the field of psychology. And as I said, it's a new field at this time. So beyond medicine, just to understand that the women who spoke out, who wanted careers or education, that was extremely foreign, and they had to be moved from one sphere to they couldn't juggle the sphere. It was often that they had to choose. Many women who did seek careers at this time were single for their entire life. They were also outcasts. They were paid far less than men. Sometimes they weren't allowed into various places. And just to understand how this that the true womanhood was such an ideal. In the Supreme Court case in 1873, Bradwell versus Illinois, about the right of women to work outside the home, the court said, "Man is or should be woman's protector and defender. The natural and proper timidity and delicacy which belongs to the female sex evidently fits it for many of the occupants of civil life. The domestic sphere properly belongs to the domain and functions of womanhood. The paramount destiny and mission of women are to fulfill the noble benign offices of wife and mother. This is the law of the Creator, and the rules of civil society must be adapted to the general constitution of things and cannot be based upon exceptional cases." So that is the Supreme Court's decision in 1873 that women should not be allowed to work in the workplace. However, many women like Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony absolutely rejected this ideal, and Stanton was a key organizer of the first women's convention in Seneca Falls in 1848. Until her death, she is a fighter for the cause of women. She was there. Sorry, the Gathering for Women's Rights and for Women in has the civil and political rights, stated that both women and men are created equally, and denounced laws that restricted the opportunity of women. And this is the role of the Seneca Falls Convention in 1848. And you're like, why 1848? Well, we talked about during Reconstruction period that there is a split from the women's rights movements from supporting African Americans and their goal for equality. And so it goes back to 1848 when you have the first women's convention. During the Civil War, it dies out to a bit because it's focused on the war. In Reconstruction, there is a split between it, and most people don't want to listen. Now, despite this kind of idea of the true womanhood in the late 19th century, this kind of led indirectly to new roles for women particularly in the middle class. Both men and women began to delay marriage until till later in life, and marriage rates for white men and women declined significantly from 1880 to 1890s. Women began to marry and have children later in life, and they began to delay what it meant. And this is the reason why, because they wanted to go to school and they wanted to go to work. So if you couldn't have the true life, this understanding, if you can't have a balance between work and education and a family, women began to push that off, and so they would get married later and later. Well, women did marry in the middle class and began to have more children. By 1850, the fertility rate for most white Americans, and we don't have, the reason why we're saying white Americans is because there's not a lot of statistics on other people of color or Native Americans at this time, was 5.28 births per couple. By 1910, the birth rate went to 3.4 births per couple. And this is birth, not survival of children, I might add.